Okay, we are live on the air. This is Luke Johnson from Noetic, the humanities teaching app. Today, my guest is Craig Campbell. He's a bit of a personal hero of mine. He's done a ton of curation and narration of Soren Kierkegaard's work for YouTube and LibriVox, and I suppose other places that Craig can tell us about. But today we're going to be talking about Soren Kierkegaard's The Moment, especially installment 10, the appendix. I'm going to be using the Hong edition. That's what my notes are from, and that's what I'll be operating from it. I believe Craig will be using the Walter Lowry edition. So there may be some discrepancy in the translation in our remarks, but hopefully that will lead to a very fruitful conversation. So I'm going to hand it over to Craig. I believe he had a passage that he wanted to inaugurate this seminar with.
Thanks, Luke. Okay, my name is Craig Campbell, and I live in Wisconsin. I'm going to begin this with a little quote from Kierkegaard's Journals and Letters, 11-2-A-423. He writes about the obedient hound. Imagine a big, well-trained hunting hound. He accompanies his master on a visit to a family where, as all too often happens in our time, there is a whole assembly of ill-behaved youths. Their eyes hardly light on the hound before they begin to maltreat it in every kind of way. The hound, which was well trained, as these youths were not, fixes its eyes at once upon his master to ascertain from his expression what he expects him to do. And he understands a glance to mean that he is to put up with all the ill treatment, accept it indeed as though it were sheer kindness conferred upon him. Thereupon the youths, of course, become still more rough. And finally they agreed that it must be a prodigiously stupid dog which puts up with everything. The dog, meanwhile, is concerned with only one thing, what the master's glance commands him to do. And lo, that glance is suddenly altered. It signifies, and the hound understands it at once. Use your strength. That instant, with a single leap, he has seized the biggest lout and thrown him to the ground. And now no one stops him, except the master's glance. And the same instant, he is as it was a moment before. Just so with me. And I think this sums up Kierkegaard's writing of this book and maybe his life as a writer. He started out pretty gentle with comic kind of things. And he wrote and wrote and wrote. And he kept saying, why don't people understand me? And at one point he said, they don't want to understand me. But he continued to write because he thinks the idea of Christianity is worth saving. And the moment is now him at full strength standing and throwing the lout down, which I think is Christendom.
Yes, I think that it's going to set a very good tone for the rest of our conversation. Now, I think you were telling me one of the differences between the Hong edition and the Lowry edition is that the Lowry edition has passages like this that are associated with each of the sections in The Moment. Is that correct?
Yes.
Are they all from his journals, or are they do they draw from his entire corpus?
They draw from the journals.
I see. I've yet to closely read his journals. I bet they would be really rewarding and need to go through that. So maybe we should say something about in previous installments of the discussion of The Moment, I have spoken about kind of the historical background of this particular text, but this 10th installment is very special in the sense that is it the only posthumous work of Soren Kierkegaard's, or would you count the journals as well? Because it was, from what I understand, it was written and ready to go to the publishers, but he actually passed away before it could hit the printing press, and so it came out after he died. And I briefly looked at your notes, And it seemed like you were probably a little bit more familiar with the biography of this particular installment of the moment.
Well, this installment starts on August 25th, 1855, and the first installment of the moment, this is a 10th of the instant, the first installment of the moment started in August of 1855. So they paralleled it pretty much, these writings. It could have been a last effort to say, this is what I really mean. It could have been maybe a skeleton saying, this is what I'm working from. Maybe it wasn't not called number 10. Maybe it wasn't ready to go to press, but it was on his desk and he was dead. So it was left to the interpreter to decide, well, what is this? He was taken to the hospital on October 2nd in 1855 and died November 11th, 1855.
How familiar are you with the circumstances of his death?
Well, I just have read certain things that people came to see him and others, and that he was happy sometimes and not happy other times, but that he died peacefully.
What did he ultimately succumb to? I've heard some pretty wild theories. Do you have any conjectures, or what do you think is the best competing hypothesis about what did him in?
It could be overwork.
Yeah,
and not taking care of himself. I know that if I get working on something that I decide not to eat, I just keep going. And I don't know how Kierkegaard wrote all this and ate and did other things and took all his walks all the time. But he fell out of a tree, and some people say that injury causes death. But he was a child when that happened, and I don't know how they make that leap. Others say he had a spinal problem. Doctors can always prescribe 200 years in foresight, I suppose, and look at him and say, or hindsight, and say, this is what he died from. But I don't think they have an exact diagnosis.
Yeah, I didn't know if it was possible to actually die from exhaustion, but maybe I should look out for that.
Well, I don't know if that's what it was.
No, I don't. It's probably an experiment I don't need to test on myself. So
but he did like to take his walks, and he did like to write, and he did like to keep active.
Yeah, I understood it. I've heard someone say that he drank something approximating like 40 cups of coffee a day. I don't know if he poisoned himself in some way. I don't know. So the moment installment 10, I have it broken down into 7 installments in the Hong edition, and we can talk about how they're sort of loosely translated or how they're translated into the Lowry and see if there's a significant difference. The first is what I call an optical illusion. The second section is from John chapter 5, verse 44. How can you have faith, you who receive glory from one another? The third section is what the rejoinder replies. The fourth section is that Christendom's crime is comparable to wanting to appropriate an inheritance unjustifiably. Section 5 is when is the moment. 6 is my task, and 7 in the Hong edition is labeled minor remarks. How are they labeled in Lowry?
What is what I call an optical illusion? How can ye believe who receive honor from one another? What is the instant? Let's see, down to my task. And little observations.
Okay. Well, why don't we jump right into the first section, what I call an optical illusion. And I notice in the Hong edition, in the 10th installment, they've bracketed in there on draft from August 25th. I suppose that is to indicate that this wasn't a completed process. I don't know if that's an important thing to point out or whatnot, but we get this illustration of an idea that will pervade the entire work by Kierkegaard discussing 2 bishops that were pretty popular in Copenhagen at the time, Bishop Minster and Bishop Martinson. And I'm sure you have a lot to say about both of them. He seems, at least in my translation, the tenor of it is that he is much more sympathetic to Bishop Martinson, although I've heard that the relationship was not the most stable. And then he seems to come down very hard on Bishop Minster. And I think he takes Bishop Minster, as far as I can tell here, in what I call an optical illusion, as being a representative of what is wrong with Christendom, as someone who has found a way to turn Christendom into a money-making machine, whereas Professor Martinson would be someone who is more authentically called to proclaim the word without pay, who did not seek title or stature within Christendom, and that he might have been a bit of a threat to Bishop Minster, because he would have set an example for how perhaps a true Christian witness would live. It wouldn't necessarily be someone who would be trying to rake in as much money off the mechanism that had become the established Christendom. So what did you make of this first section? And maybe I know you're not just familiar with Kierkegaard. I know you're familiar with just kind of everyone that was in that particular epoch as well. Perhaps what you can say about Bishop Minster and Bishop Martinson in regards to this particular passage.
Well, his father was involved with the church, and Minster visited the family, and they would have conversations. His father was more the philosopher, Minster was more the theologian, and they would talk. His brother was going to be a minister, Peter. He also became a bishop later. But they would carry on conversations, and they would debate Christianity. And I think Kierkegaard got an idea that you can sit and debate Christianity and talk about it an awful long time and never do anything that's Christian. And maybe Minster in 1842 had gone to the king. And as what was happening was that the Baptists were coming into Denmark, and they were preaching, and they were living there as Baptists, but they didn't want to get their children baptized. So Minster said to the king, we need to get these children baptized. And so the king agreed that they should be baptized. This was 1 year before Kierkegaard started writing in 1843. So a law was passed, and the pastors forcibly baptized the children of Baptists living in Denmark.
Do they charge for this as well?
They didn't charge for it, but then later the Baptists began preaching. There's my other phone is ringing. And Pastor Martinson went, and he said, well, he wrote something about what are we going to do about these Baptists? And then they passed a law saying, if you find a Baptist preaching, you can call the police, and the police would arrest them and they'd be fined. So they wanted to keep a pure Christianity, what's called the perfected Christianity, which would be like Lutheranism, where Denmark would be a state Lutheran church. And if everybody was just a Lutheran, they would really have a good Christianity. And the Baptists were causing troubles with this. And this is where Christendom, the state, and the church working together can be a very bad thing for Christianity.
I see. Like that's really fascinating. Aside from the forcible baptism, was there anything like Kierkegaard observed from Bishop Minster, like as a youth, that made him think that this person really wasn't interested in the practice of Christianity, that it was all just about usury of some sort? And I guess it sounds like Minster may have set the example for just the person endlessly caught up in cogitation and objective reflective thought that never really makes sort of any of the existential commitment that Kierkegaard's interested in. It sounds like he may have been the prototype for that particular individual he had in mind. I always thought it might have been Hegel, but
well, Minster was a student of Rousseau. And so he read some of Rousseau's works, and it caused him to have his own crisis of faith and things like that, even while he was a pastor.
So he kind of had a loss of faith, but he was still shepherding people and saying, hey, you got to do this, you got to do this. But internally, he may have been hollowed out by his doubt.
Right. He may have been hollowed out by his doubt, but he overcame it, and he became someone who became, I think, someone that was respected in Denmark and was a good minister. There wasn't anything wrong with him. It may have been things that his father said to Minster that Kierkegaard heard that he didn't like. This whole idea of a 12-year-old boy cursing God and thinking that his whole family is cursed and that he's 82 years old and he can't be forgiven. Kierkegaard was a very strong proponent of the forgiveness of sins, and that everybody should know their sins can be forgiven. And I think he was disappointed that his father, in all that time, couldn't figure it out, more than that it hurt him so badly.
Why do you think his father couldn't get his mind around that? Why do you because it seems relatively obvious to, I mean, at my youngish age, that you have to be able to let go of those things.
Well, he was raised more in a Moravian church, and they were very pious. The Moravians were very instrumental in the conversion of Jonathan Edwards, and they were a German church. But this whole idea of the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit and what it is something that irked Kierkegaard when people said, this is the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. If you do this, there's no salvation for you. There's no choice. There's no chance. It makes you close your mind, and then you think God can't love me anymore because this external person said something to you about something you did. And maybe Minster had said something, or maybe Martinson had said something, but Martinson was more Kierkegaard's age.
I see. Well, what is your understanding of Kierkegaard's relationship with Martinson? Because it seems to be more complicated. With the Minster one, it seems like he pretty obviously has disdain for Bishop Minster, but Martinson
Minster never called himself. He gave a sermon and said that he's not a witness to the truth while he was alive. Martinson, when he was dead, said he was a witness for the truth.
Oh, so that Minster was, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so Minster was humble enough to say, I'm not in the line of the apostles. You know, somebody didn't lay their hand on me all the way back to St. Peter or someone. And Martinson tried to interject that into the system, and so that the successor is saying that the predecessor was this great person, and maybe I'll be as great as him.
Yeah.
But Martinson was Kierkegaard's tutor and then his teacher. He wrote books as early as 1841. He studied Jacob Boehme, and he studied mysticism. He believed that science and Christianity could get along very well, and that Christianity could possibly be proven through scientific methods. So Kierkegaard was as much against Martinson because Martinson was such a Hegelian.
I see that. So that's where he got a lot of his revulsion from Hegelianism. Well, but he didn't. I mean, obviously, if he worked closely with Martinson, they must have had some cordial relationship, right?
Yes, I mean, they walked every Thursday.
Yeah, so they weren't completely alienated from one another. I guess it was just kind of like a healthy disagreement between the two throughout most of their life, or did they have a falling out at some point?
I don't think they had a falling out. He would send books to them. He would send some of his books to Martinson to see if he could get some feedback, and he would send books to Minster. Martinson reviewed some of his books. So they didn't have really any kind of falling out that I know of. But I'm not an expert.
I'm learning a ton from you. I'm enjoying this. It does seem, though, that, I mean, in my edition, the Hong edition, it does seem like that he speaks rather flatteringly of Martinson in comparison to Minster. But if he seemed to object to both of them, what do you think accounts for the difference? Or did you get a different tone in your Lowry translation? He does say
I
something
think
about
that Martinson wants to preach the word, and he can go to any minister and say, do you mind if I preach in your church today? And they'll say yes, and he would be able to preach. And that's a good thing. But then he might be a court preacher. Minster was a court preacher. And so he was making the $400 for 12 sermons.
Right.
And Kierkegaard just had something in him that all this money that was involved in churches was not a good thing.
So the distinction ultimately came down to mammon. Even though he could disagree with both of these individuals intellectually, it was a question about what was motivating them.
Right.
So,
and the poor can't afford the church. A lot of poor people couldn't even go to church because they couldn't afford it.
Could you shed some historical light on that? Because that's such a strange thing to me, because my only reference is like this country church that I grew up in out here in the middle of nowhere, where, you know, of course the collection plate is passed or whatever, but it's completely optional. How did money in the congregation work, as far as you understand it, in Copenhagen at that time?
It was pretty much based on what kind of wealth you had. They were expected to tithe. People would be admitted to the closer pews if they had more money.
Really?
And then they'd be back further and further. I read an article about I think it was the Presbyterians, and they had to have that fight. You know, the churches that are called free churches, those all have to do with money. It's a free church. Nobody has to give anything. You can come and sit down and you don't have to put any money in the plate. Now, in my church, they would publish a booklet every year, and it would say how much everyone gave.
Wow.
And it would go to every member, and we could look, and I'd look through and I go, oh, Dad, you're not doing too much here, you know? And I could see who the wealthy people in the congregation were, and which my friends probably whose families had money. And that stopped after a while. But now they say, so many families gave 50 a week, so many gave 100 a week, so many gave 20 a week, so many gave 14 cents a week, you know. And I don't think that has much to do with Christianity either. And Kierkegaard was looking at that and wondering, what does this really have to do when we're sitting up here saying that we want to take care of the poor and the helpless? And then we want to say, well, how much do you have for us? When we should be saying, how much do we have for you?
That's really incredible, that insight, because it's not only is it advancing some individuals, but it's shaming other individuals, and it's creating inequality within the church congregation, which totally runs antithetical to the idea of becoming equal before Christ.
Right. He was really concerned with that equality before Christ, and he talked about the Good Samaritan a lot, and he said, what if you have a Good Samaritan and he's walking along and he gets beaten up? Along comes this person who's going to help him. Well, he's got a donkey. He's got enough money to take him to an inn, to get him taken care of. He has all this stuff. Well, what if somebody comes and he doesn't have a donkey? What if he doesn't have any money? What if all he can do is get him a cup of water?
Right.
Well, is that a good work? Well, sure. Is he a good Samaritan? Yes. What if he can't do anything and he's with them and he got beat up? And all he can do is say a prayer for the guy, because there he is laying beside him and he's maybe dying too, but he says a prayer. Is that a work of mercy? And he talked about that in works of love. And the $10,000 and the widow's mite, all those things were really bothering Kierkegaard. All the comparisons between wealth and the hugeness of the work that was being done in the church by the number of people involved and the amount of money and things like that.
I think that feeds nicely into the second section from John, chapter 5, verse 44, how you can believe you should receive glory from one another. He has this from page 332 from the Hong edition. He says, the Christianity of the New Testament is to love God in a relation of opposition to people, to suffer for the doctrine at the hands of people. Only that as believing to receive glory from one another makes it impossible to believe. So I can see how this stratification along money lines would make it make it so that individuals are pursuing their Christianity in regards to rank and not really drawing before God, but really drawing before the congregation, saying, no, I am the most generous. I am the person with the greatest influence in here. And for Kierkegaard to kind of say that, right, it sort of upsets that order of Christendom. And he's very concerned about it because he thinks that what's being preached in these congregations that are so driven by mammon is I like the analogy that he used. He talked about how like children are given like watered down drink in order to feel like they're sort of participating in the process of imbibing or whatever. And I think he thinks the same thing is happening with Christianity within Christendom at that time. They're not really given the strong, powerful thing to imbibe. They're given some sort of like watered down lemonade or something to that effect. And he says
you called it lemonade twaddle.
Right. And that he would actually, I thought it was kind of interesting. He talked about how he would rather participate in the most absurd form of nationalism, like pledging to the flag and wearing ridiculous uniforms and riding around on a hobby horse or whatever, than to be a part of what he saw as a bastardization of Christianity with this form of institutionalized Christendom.
Yeah, I agree with that. And he mentions a castle in the air in that part where they've got this beautiful castle and everyone's up there and everything's perfect in this castle. It's kind of like Hegel's system where everybody builds a system but nobody lives in it.
Right.
But the church is building this castle, this beautiful place. And he's really, I think, against Christian states, Christian kingdoms, where a whole state has to be a Christian, where there's no resistance to Christianity because Christianity can't take it, can't handle any resistance. He spoke about in one place about where Christ said in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are you if you're persecuted and that you suffer for righteousness' sake." And so he's taking that text and he's saying, you're supposed to be suffering and being persecuted. Maybe God sent some of these people to help you to be suffering and persecuted. And it's like, well, why are you yelling at me all the time? I'm a good Christian. Well, because I'm here to help you suffer and be persecuted. Oh, okay.
Well, I think I'm curious to see how that feeds into the next section, what the rejoinder replies, because
this one's called what the echo answers.
Right. I think I like the translation better in yours. And he talks about how the individual who is successful in terms of in the temporal realm and has earthly things, and is proclaiming Christianity is some kind of liar. But if someone comes about and makes a bunch of like he talks about this, there being this lunatic, right, that is sort of that may have some elements of true Christianity, may call a spade, may be going around. I sort of imagined him a little bit like Nietzsche's madman, but more theologically inspired. But then there was this more dramatic version of the individual who is persecuted and cast out from the community altogether. And perhaps I'm going a little fast over that, but I wanted to sort of understand how it could get worse than being called a lunatic. If like Kierkegaard really saw himself as someone beyond the lunatic and someone that needed to be put to death, needed to be totally excommunicated, and how he understood that death penalty, like what that really meant in this context. Because sometimes something that I get a little bit worried about is sometimes that Christians get a little bit of a persecution complex, that they think like people are out to get them all the time. But what in this context constituted persecution for Kierkegaard as you see it?
I think it was a Corsair affair that he considered as persecution, and he didn't do anything about it. He wrote the article that started it. He answered. He wrote nice stories and nice things, very well thought out. He didn't call anyone names. And the school teachers in Copenhagen would, because of the Corsair, would tell their children, don't be a Soren, because of the way he was. he would walk all the time, and some of the people wouldn't want to walk with him. He'd say, "Oh, would you take a walk with me?" "Oh, no, I don't really want to be seen with you now," because of what the Corsair did. And that didn't just happen in 1845, that happened all the way through the 1850s, that they continued doing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, what I thought was really interesting about this text is throughout the incident in the moment, you see these flashes of real anger. And you can see how that constant taunting and that ridicule and that ostracization, like, it seems like it really took a toll on him. Like, I'm not really sure that I've seen it as much here as anywhere else, that he really allows for those seething wounds to be on display. It seemed to be a little out of character. I don't know anywhere else that he does it like this. Perhaps in the journals.
Well, in the journals, he talks about things, and he talks about Martinson and Minster in the journals quite often. But he is at the end. He might have been knowing he's sick, and maybe he just wants to get his feelings out. He's not really bad compared to what other people could be saying.
True.
He's just letting his emotions run a little bit, and he does believe in passion.
Yeah, it's just like whenever he delivered blows upon anyone before, it was always done poetically and ironically. It was never like, it's like, "I'm going to get you," or "How dare you for doing what you did." There's not always that righteous indignation like there is in this text. I've noticed in other ones. But I guess the big thing is, like, when you're trying to talk about like what made him excluded and what he felt like excluded from this worldly Christendom, is that the Christianity, New Testament Christianity, the thing that he's very interested in promulgating and trying to bring back, this sort of dying to oneself and serving God, is not necessarily the one that's on display. Like, that ultimately the horse and the cart have been switched, and people have found a way for Christianity to try to serve them and serve their interests rather than them serving Christianity. And that's going to be the thing that ultimately gets him sort of the death sentence from worldly Christendom. Is that kind of the right way to understand it? Is that how you think of it?
Yes, I agree that some of his problems came from attacking the clergy. Denmark was Lutheran all the time, and nobody really attacked the church. It's common to attack the Catholic Church because they were so powerful, and to attack maybe the Lutheran Church in Germany because it was so powerful when it was the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire ended in 1806. So really, Germany had been this battle horse for the English and the French throughout that whole time. There was no Germany. And it started in about 800, so it's about 1,000-year reign of the Holy Roman Empire. It's ended, new things are happening. Christianity has to change. There's people walking around. Now's the time to get rid of Christianity. We've learned everything we can. It's had 1,000 years to perfect itself. And that's why he says Christendom believed Christianity is perfectible, that you can get to a stage that you've created a church that will turn out the perfect Christian. Mm-hmm. And every one of them will be perfect. And you'll just have this perfect society that we're kind of looking for now in our culture through medicine and doctors and all these social sciences. And he's saying that they have to stop with renunciation and imitation of Christ, that every single individual has to know how to give up certain things, how to make a decision that, this isn't very good for my life, and how to imitate Christ. And those are the things they should be preaching about, instead of, "Oh, look how far we've come. Our next 5-year mission is to do this."
Right. It's interesting, and I think this feeds pretty well into the fourth section, that Christendom's crime is comparable to wanting an inheritance to appropriate unjustifiably. He paints this sort of imagined scenario where there's a benefactor who leaves, and in his will he says, "Well, look, you have this fortune coming. You just have to carry out this one task." and then the individual sort of usurps the fortune without carrying out that responsibility. And he thinks that Christendom has done that, so that they get to sort of enjoy the fruits of Christianity without taking up the responsibility of the imitation of Christ, which seemed kind of interesting to me because I didn't really see how those were severable. To me,
could you say that again?
Yeah, that didn't really seem possible to me, that you could get the fortune that is Christianity without the responsibility of the imitation of Christ. And then he goes on to say that essentially that the imitation of Christ is also where the gift lies, so that there is this distorted, disrupted view of what it means to be an heir to Christianity without this commitment, that it's ultimately impossible. And that's why we get Christendom, and that people sort of make these faint half measures by trying to do like the baptismal certificates and things of that nature to get something that approximates the real dedicated commitment to Christ.
And the baptismal certificate is an external thing.
Right.
And he's saying that they had mistaken the external for the internal. The baptism of the heart is something different than this baptism that you did as a child. And I read the autobiography of Goethe for LibriVox. I read part of it. And he had mentioned that he was in church and he would see a baptism, and he only could remember seeing baptisms. But it wasn't anything that any Lutheran experienced, because it always happened when they were children. And that you should be experiencing the full Christian life. That maybe he was against this idea of baptizing when they're so young also, and not making sure that there was that inner baptism that should take place later. The church has confirmation, in which they go through special training to at about 15 to say that, yes, I agree with the Lutheran Church and what these tenets are. But the heir of the kingdom, the kingdom of God is within you. The kingdom is given to you. But the shortcut of baptism, it does take you away from having to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. It does take you away from having to imitate Christ. You don't know where you are with Christianity quite often. Where in baptism, you're saved before you even begin. And he made the analogy that everybody gets in the train and they have a nice ride to heaven in good company.
I love it. And I think he picks up this theme in a different way. I loved how you brought in this difference between the external and the internal, because in the next section, when is the moment, he talks about how much worldly sagacity, I guess maybe the empiricism or the Hegelianism of Martinson probably was the motivation for this, that so many individuals are trying to find something that is like the communion with God through objective means, through scientific means, through philosophical means, and that ultimately worldly sagacity is not going to be sort of concerned with the moment or what he calls the woof of eternity, that these are all external as well, and that ultimately it's not going to be a matter of fact-finding. It's not going to be a matter of philosophical investigation that is going to get you the moment, but ultimately going to be something that is ventured. Ultimately is going to be something that is made, like you mentioned earlier, in fear and trembling.
Yes, I think that's true. In Works of Love, he made the same analogy with the moment of falling in love. And somebody says, well, how do you fall in love? And the person would say, here's a picture of Romeo and Juliet. Take a look at it and study it, and you'll know how to fall in love. Oh, okay, thank you. And that's how they would do it. And he thought that would just be ridiculous to look at a picture and say, oh, that's going to help me fall in love. And we've done that with these movies and with everything else, where we don't even know what our own feelings are anymore, because love has been depicted in all these films as so many different things, and quite often so hard to do.
Oh yeah, I can only imagine how Kierkegaard would have savaged our fixation with romantic love. I mean, I think it's there in a number of his texts already. But yeah, I think it's very interesting how the idolatry that's on full display when we're in our culture that's so obsessed with romance. The next section, My Task, from September 1, 1855. And I thought this is one of the more fascinating sections in what we prepared for today.
I just had one other thing about,
sure,
we were still in the moment, weren't we?
Yes, we were.
I just wanted to share a little bit from the Moral of Philosophic Fragments.
Oh, please do.
He wrote that book, and at the end he wrote that this is the moral, and he says we assumed a new organ, and it's called faith. Now, doctors in the 1800s, once they started doing surgery and things, they wanted to find the soul in the body, and they couldn't find it, and they thought, well, it doesn't exist. And I read a thing from one German doctor who said, we've looked at every part of the body after it's decomposed, and it's all organic. There isn't anything in there that's not organic. So there's no soul in there. You just don't have to worry about that thing.
Well, maybe they'll develop the right instrument for detecting it one day, Craig.
Well, they made a movie about that, and they thought if they could catch the soul and keep it in a bottle, then they could have this thing that lives forever. And they could siphon a little bit off to lengthen their lives.
Well, don't you realize that you and I are uploading a little bit of our soul to the internet right now? We'll live on in the collective consciousness.
Or we could. This could be what infinity is, but I don't believe it is. And I think that there is an infinity where it is less than someone listening to someone later. But he says, we've assumed a new organ, faith, a new presupposition, the consciousness of sin, a new decision, which is the moment, and a new teacher, the God in time. And those are four things that he thinks were moving out of Christianity. That nobody really had to make the decision, and that the decision wasn't really pronounced enough for people, because the decision has to be made over and over again.
Right. I mean, that's a theme throughout his entire work about dramatizing that decision, especially in regards to emphasizing the multitude of ways that the incarnation is a paradox, the limitations of of what we take to be reality. I love essentially his endeavor, like when he takes on science and metaphysics and proving God and stuff like that, is really not too different from what Kant did. And I love how he sort of takes up that torch from Kant. Should we progress into My Task? Is that okay?
Yeah, we can do the task.
Yeah. So I thought was really interesting about this is that, Kierkegaard starts off this section talking about why he doesn't call himself a Christian. And I had seen in other places, a big part of the reason why he didn't talk about being a Christian is because that it's not sort of a final once and for all commitment. It's like you said just a moment ago, it's something, the relationship with Christ has to be constantly appropriated. It's a state of becoming. You don't just like have this one experience. Although I find that to be somewhat problematic when you think about sort of the old self dying and a new self coming into existence as far as being born again. I think there's some interesting theological issues going on there, but here he gives two different reasons for why he doesn't call himself a Christian, and then elaborates on them a little bit more. The first is that he wants to distance himself from everyone within Christendom who's calling themselves a Christian, because he thinks that term is utterly vacuous given the what we've talked about earlier. And he doesn't want to be associated with the for-profit model. But he thinks that there's something really interesting, and I love how he brings Socrates. As many people know, he spoke about Socrates a great deal in his master's thesis or doctoral dissertation, however you want to categorize it, the concept of irony. But he talks about his task being a Socratic task. And I think I've maybe even heard you read this somewhere before, but on page 341, he says, the only analogy I have before me is Socrates. My task is a Socratic task, to audit the definition of what it is to be a Christian. I do not call myself a Christian, keeping the ideal free, but I can make it manifest that the others are that even less. And that's from page 341. it seems like he thinks that part of the reason Socrates was so successful is by claiming ignorance, that he didn't know anything. Somehow he was more effective at rendering aporia and showing everybody else that they didn't know anything else either. Like if Socrates had been like, no, it is only I that knows the truth, he wouldn't have been as effective in that task. And Kierkegaard, similarly, by saying that he's not the truth witness, by saying, hey, look, I don't know what I am. I'm not calling myself a true Christian, but I definitely know what being a true Christian is not. That is actually a more successful way to precipitate inward reflection and get people to actually make the existential movements that you want. What did you think about this?
I liked what you said there. I think that Kierkegaard wanted to get first he sees it as a joke, I think. Let's say everybody in Denmark is walking around and they just think they're Christians, and somebody says to Kierkegaard, well, what do you think about the church? And he says, well, I don't know, I'm not a Christian. And he says, what? What's wrong with you? You're not a Christian? You've lived here all your life. We're all Christians. And he makes a joke that one person could say to him, well, look at this map here. And you've seen these maps. This is a nice map. It shows Denmark is red. This country is red. These are the Christian countries. This country is red. This country over here is green. They're not Christians. These are the Christian countries, and everyone that lives in them is a Christian. And that's how you get this inheritance for free. You know, you just live in the red country on the map.
Yeah, I remember as a child, I remember when I was a little child, I would see these maps and I'd be like, yes, I'm on the winning team.
That's right. And, you know, I think that kind of objectivity is kind of funny. But there was a book written in 1823 by Jeremy Bentham. It was called Not Paul, but Jesus. And he's mentioning the apostles in here. And he's saying that he hasn't criticized the apostles. Now, Bentham was criticizing Paul and saying Paul was only converted externally. He wasn't converted internally. And therefore, he was only going to follow Jesus. And it was a popular book at that time. And there were a lot of people criticizing the apostles. They weren't criticizing Christ so much. And Kierkegaard was thinking, you can't start tearing out certain parts and saying this long line of successors is not going to go back to the apostles. Nobody was a witness to the truth, not even the apostles.
I never knew Bentham wrote on such matters. You know, I think of Bentham, I think about him being so scientific in his morality. I didn't know he was preoccupied with religious matters.
He wrote on prison reform, how to make a prison, how much room every prisoner should get, all kinds of things.
Yeah, and the hedons. I remember, right? It was him, right, that came up with the actual measure for pleasure or something like that for utilitarianism or whatever.
Right. Well, I was in a prison.
Yeah.
So he says, I'm not even a Christian. He said it many times, and you expressed it right when you said that Christianity is something that you should be striving for. If you say that you are a Christian, then the ideal isn't free anymore. Then you are the new paradigm. You are the pattern. You're the new Christ.
How do you do? Whenever someone asks me, they're like, or they'll say something to the effect of like, "Hey, Luke, you're a Christian," or like this or that, and I said, I always remark, I try to be one. That's how I always sort of qualify it. I try. And I'm sort of taking my cue from Kierkegaard on that when I use that sort of language. I don't know. I mean, yeah, well, because
I was walking down the street and a person came up to me and said, "Are you a Christian?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Give me $1." And I said, "Why should I give you $1? If you're a Christian, you'd give me $1." Okay. And maybe that's a trap that happens. Who knows? I thought, well, now I can't say I'm a Christian. It'll cost me $1 every time.
Yeah. There's lots of ways to feel baited. And I think Kierkegaard obviously felt baited into some of these conversations, especially about trying to say that he was this truth witness. And what he says also, by analogizing himself with Socrates, that just like Socrates, he's made a number of enemies within the culture at large. So we have a number of in closing here, and I want to, we'll go through these, I'm sure, rather quickly, because we've talked about a lot of these ideas, but I don't know, actually some of them are pretty interesting. Maybe we'll dwell on them a long time. We'll see. In my version, the Hong version, I have 10 subsections in the 7th section. I don't know if they divided it up similarly in Lowry. They're entitled "The Pastor's Divine Worship," "The Pastor and the Actor," "The Pastor as a Folding Screen," "Paganism, the Christianity of Christendom," "Frightful Proportion," "Hardiness and Heartlessness," "Sophisticated Villainy," "Is for the Sake of the Successor," "Convention Beer," and "The Higher Wisdom in There Being a Predecessor and a Successor." Not sure if yours are partitioned in the same way or partitioned at all. How did Lowry deal with these fragments here at the end?
He partitioned them into the same kinds of sections. He just renamed them a little differently.
Okay. Well, let's see. The pastor's divine worship. I mean, I think we've talked about this a little bit, and I think it should be obvious. He talks about how there's this imagined scenario where God says that you don't go to Deer Park. I'm not sure why he chose the example of Deer Park, and then humans get this idea. Okay, well, look, if we just sort of bless the way that one gets to Deer Park, and we create all these like layers of sacredness around it or whatever, it becomes legitimate to go to the place where we're actually forbidden to go. And I think the question here in just sort of thinking about this imagined scenario is like kind of what the point of that is. Like, relative to the example of Christendom, what do you think it is that God is forbidding us to do? And I wonder if it's just, if it comes down to the money issue again, if Kierkegaard just thinks it's all filthy lucre, or is it something else? What is the divine prohibition that he's probably trying to get us to reflect on within the culture?
I think that Kierkegaard said the opposite of virtue isn't vice, it's faith.
Yeah, he said for certain, I know he said the opposite.
No, the faith isn't the opposite of virtue. Vice isn't the opposite of virtue. Faith is the opposite of vice.
Yes. Sin and faith are opposites, not sin and virtue, because there's still a form of sin in virtue. Virtue that's autonomous without reference to God.
Some churches said you can't dance or you're sinning. Some said you can't play cards or you're sinning. They were saying you can't go to the Deer Park. Kierkegaard and concluding unscientific postscript said he had this spy he was sending out all over, and he sent him to the bowling alley, and his spy found out you could take the thought of God to the bowling alley. And then he sent the spy out to the amusement park, and the spy found out that people could take the thought of God to the amusement park. They wouldn't all just become crazy. The theater was a new thing. Shakespeare was being translated into German and was big in Denmark. The vaudeville was opening, and everybody has to decide, what is good for people, what is good for our children, what's good for my husband, what's good for my wife, and all these new forms of entertainment that keep popping up. I mean, it's hard. What does the church say? Do they say don't go on the internet? Do they say don't look at pornography? Do they say don't look at this, don't look at that? This movie will kill you. If you watch this movie, you'll go to hell.
Right. Oh, I see what you're saying. So like if they say, oh, well, don't like, maybe an example of this would perhaps be, and I'm just drawing this out of thin air to illustrate the example, and it may be a bad illustration, but let's say the church says something to the effect of, well, don't glorify violence. And then, then you have like Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ come along. And so then it's sort of sanctified and particularly marketed towards Christian audiences. Do you think that would be an example of what Kierkegaard was trying to get at here with this particular thought experiment?
He thought that you wouldn't have that kind of movie because you don't want to have these imaginary constructions that put a fixed idea in someone's head of what Christ's suffering was. When you read the Bible, you'll know in your own mind, well, what was his suffering like? And you form your own inwardness about it. And if this fixed idea comes out, like with the 10 Commandments and everything else, there's this awe and this wonder and these scenes and everything. But Kierkegaard was against this. That's more externalizing. That's profit. It's something that's not really beneficial to the Christian.
I see. And I think that actually does illustrate the idea pretty well. Then the second subsection, the pastor versus the actor, it's pretty short here. I think what he's trying to say is like, well, at least actors are honest about acting. Pastors aren't even honest about being really actors. And I think that probably goes back to how he knew that Bishop Minster was living a double life. I thought unless you had something else to say there, I thought the third subsection was kind of interesting. The pastor as a folding screen, and how individuals are able to sort of shirk their responsibility. But perhaps I'm progressing a little too quickly. Did you want to say anything about the pastor, the actor subsection?
Well, the actor was a theatrical person, and I think Kierkegaard saw that the whole church service was becoming more theatrical. The actor was sometimes not allowed to be buried. The actor was seen as this degenerate person. It took a long time for actors to become respected as they are now. Now they're almost gods and goddesses, but they had to work their way up to it throughout history. And the minister is just as much putting on a show, but he's a very respected individual, even though he's doing the same kind of thing that the actor is. He's playing a part and rehearsing a scene and making his sermon.
That's interesting. Why do you have any understanding why that actors at that time were considered to be degenerates?
Oh, it just all came back from the Middle Ages. I read a thing by a guy named Nettleschein, and he wrote in the late 1400s that they were starting this stage screen thing where it was shadow acting, and all the shadow acting had to do with rape. So they'd always show rape, and then people would get the idea that rape was all right. And he thinks some of the negative things they show, the idea came that if you keep showing negative things, that people are going to begin to do those things. I mean, not everybody gets a good idea of how to go and cut somebody up unless they watch it in a movie, I guess.
Yeah. I see. Craig, I just wanted to give you a heads up. For some reason, I believe my my battery charger is dying, so we may have to proceed a little bit more briskly through the end of this.
All right, that's fine. We've gone almost an hour.
I think we've covered a lot of the really big ideas.
Let's just take a look and see if there's anything else you want to cover, and I'll take a look and see, unless you want to keep going through faster.
Yeah, maybe just go maybe a little bit of a faster clip. I think something that was kind of interesting. He talks about how the pastor is a folding screen, and there he says that people make stands and convictions, and then they sort of use their silent business partner or their spouse as being like, yeah, I totally agree with you, but my husband or wife would never let me do that, so sorry. Or like my business partner won't let me do that. And I think what a lot of people in the congregation would want to take a stand, but then they would defer to the authority of the pastor and be like, yeah, I can't do that. That'd be at odds with what my pastor would want me to do. I thought that was kind of interesting. And then the next subsection, paganism, the Christianity of Christendom, thought was interesting how he likened paganism to alcoholism, the intemperance of alcoholism, but that Christendom was worse in the sense that it was almost like an alcoholic rewarding themselves for abstaining from alcoholism. It was a very sophisticated form of abuse.
Yeah, he wrote.
It was actually worse than paganism. It reminds me of the line about praying to the idol with the passion of infinity.
Yes, you can pray to the idol with the passion of infinity and pray to the real God, and you would be praying to the real God. He wrote a little thing somewhere in the moment where he said that everyone should take an emetic and just get some of that stuff out of themselves. And I thought that was a pretty funny thing to say.
Yeah, I had to look up what an emetic was. It's a medicine that makes you vomit.
Yep.
There are some other really good things here. I thought I enjoyed how he analogized himself to the guy with the really big banknote that he couldn't break into town as, oh, this person that's woefully misunderstood. I think the most interesting thing is kind of talking about the general practices between successors and predecessors, and how like people are always blaming past problems within Christendom on the predecessor, and they talk about sort of thievery from the congregation as preparing for the successor, and how Kierkegaard wishes he could just get rid of all of that so that individuals could really practice authentic New Testament Christianity and get rid of all the blaming and covetousness that can be passed on to people that come before or after. I thought that was pretty interesting.
And it works well for politics as well as Christianity.
Yes, indeed. I hate to do this, Craig, but for some reason my computer is dying, so we might have to end it there. But I would have to say this is one of the most enlightening sessions that I've ever had. The wealth of information that you brought to this conversation is something that I've found nowhere else on the internet, and I really hope that this is an intellectual relationship that flourishes and blossoms over the course of me doing this project. I can't tell you enough how grateful I am to have you be a part of this.
Well, this has been my first experience at this, talking on the internet like this, and I enjoyed it. And I think you're a good moderator.
Thank you. All right, Craig, I will talk to you soon. I'm going to have this upload to YouTube and then to the Noetic app, which everyone should download. Okay?
All right, I'll take a look at it. Thanks, Luke.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.